But let's go ahead and get started. So hi, everybody. Sorry about the technical difficulties, and thanks again for joining us at Secular AZ today. Again, feel free to put your name in the chat, in the webinar, or on Facebook. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have some incredible programming, including these Friday updates that we have with you all. Really enjoyed last week's with Martin Quesada talking about all things Arizona. And I'm really excited about today. Next Friday, we're going to have a bit of a time change because we're going to be speaking with somebody named Manuel Mejido Costoya, and it's at a special time. He's in Portugal doing some research right now, so we are accommodating his schedule. So it's going to still be on July 7th, but it will be at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So I really hope that you all can join us still. He is going to be kicking off our conversations. This next theme that we're working on is the secular approach to homelessness. And so he has made this his life's work. And I'm really excited about this. He's going to be discussing partnering with religion to tackle homelessness beyond the culture wars. And we'll continue our themed series about our unhoused neighbors and secular solutions to housing. And then after that, we're going to continue talking about the evangelical right's obsession with guns and the Second Amendment. So it goes along with what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we are joined by Beatrice Marovich, who is an associate professor at Hanover College. Her work offers provocative reflections on the way that strange and ancient religious figures and ideas remain at work in our cultures, in our politics, and in our bodies in both beautiful and deeply unsettling ways. Her first book is titled Sister Death: Political Theologies for Living and Dying. And you can follow her Substack newsletter, Galactic Underworlds, or find her on Twitter and Instagram with the handle at BEAMAROVICH. So I apologize that I can't see you, and I still am having a weird experience with my Zoom. So I am going to just not mess with anything and let you go ahead and take it away, Beatrice. Is there anything that I missed from your bio?
No, I just was saying hi and letting everyone know where I'm currently located, which is in Louisville, Kentucky. So
right on.
Nice
So
to.
So sorry, this doesn't normally happen, so I'm just going to let you take it away. And my Zoom won't let me even mute myself at this point. So I may end up leaving again and trying to come back, but you go ahead. And Eric, thank you for being here so you can facilitate in any way that needs to happen, okay? Go ahead.
All right, great. I am going to work on sharing my screen again. Just one moment. Let's see. So is that showing up for everyone? Are you able to see the slide?
Looks like it.
Okay. Is that full view for you, or at this point, can you see my web browser?
We can, it looks like, see your browser.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. So just wanted to say thanks to Lindsay for inviting me here today, and I want to thank all of you who are here for being here and for having me come and speak with you. I was invited to speak about an article that I wrote for Religion Dispatches, which was called Fear, Guns, and the Unwinnable War Against Death, a letter to my fellow Americans. So I want to talk about this, obviously, and more specifically, I want to talk about some of the roots, the religious roots of the problem of gun violence and gun politics in America. But first, I want to take a few minutes to just introduce myself and to give you a little bit of background on who I am and where I'm coming from. So, I am an academic, a researcher, a writer, and a professor, and I teach courses in religious studies, generally speaking. And I write about a lot of things, mostly things that are related to religion. The field that I'm trained in is theological studies, and it's a pretty obscure field. a lot of my students, even when they register for my class, which is a required course at the private liberal arts college where I teach, a lot of them have no idea what theology even is, or what the word means. And I think it's also a term that a lot of secular people view with some suspicion, often for very good reasons. So I want to take a minute just to walk you through what the term in the field means to me, how I approach it, so that you all have a better sense of who I am and where I'm coming from. So the term theology comes from an ancient Greek term, theos. In ancient Greece, as you probably know, was a polytheistic cultural context. So in that ancient world, theos was more likely to signal gods in the plural, or just divinity in a more philosophical sense. I think today, a lot of people think about divinity and divine things in the singular, right? Many atheists, for instance, will say, I don't believe in God, rather than I don't believe in the gods, right? Because I think our culture has been pretty deeply impacted by monotheism, especially Christian monotheism. And people tend not to think about divinity in broader or more complex terms or categories. But historically speaking, theology has been kind of a big mess of ideas. And I didn't come to this field as a religious person. I grew up in a pretty secular family. I had grandparents on both sides of the family who were atheists. My grandmothers, I think, were pretty much atheists, but my grandmother on my dad's side of the family was Jewish, and she always liked to celebrate the holidays. And my grandmother on the other side of my family, I sometimes describe as a bit witchy. I don't know if she would identify as an atheist for sure. But when I became a college student and I started to study literature, I got really interested in trying to understand some of the religious references and spiritual subtexts of the literary tradition. So in essence, I felt like there was something there in a sort of subterranean context in a lot of literature, both contemporary and more ancient, medieval, that was making reference to religious ideas and religious views that I didn't really understand. So eventually I found myself in the field of theological studies in graduate work.
Beatrice, I hate to interrupt you, but looks like we're not seeing your slideshow properly.
Uh-oh. Let me see what's going on. Is that showing up now? Oops. Looks like it stopped the share. Sorry about that.
Try resharing it.
Yeah. I'm trying to hit resume share, but it's not letting me.
Yeah, I think something must be going on with Zoom itself today.
That's too bad. All right. Let me try one more time. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Still seeing it?
Okay, yeah, we're in business now.
Okay, great. I don't know what happened, but it's apparently okay. All right. Okay, so as I was saying, I've always approached the field of theological studies as a non-religious person who's basically just curious about the history of theological ideas. And I've always had a strong belief that non-religious people have just as much a right to study and talk about these things as religious people do. Of course, a lot of my colleagues in the field are people who grew up Christian and were a bit traumatized by their religious background and upbringing. So a lot of them are trying to work that out through their research. But nevertheless, I also think that people who aren't religious can get a lot out of the study in the field. So, you know, my own background impacts how I approach the field and even just how I define it. So generally speaking, I define theological studies as the study of theories about divine things. I tend to think about it as a branch of philosophy, although lots of theologians will argue that it's something totally different. My biggest research interest in the field has always been in the impact that theological ideas have on secular culture. So you might have heard of the 20th century, mid-20th century German jurist Carl Schmitt. He's become kind of famous in conversations around an academic subfield called political theology. And his sort of notorious claim is that all Western political ideas are secularized theological concepts. So that's all Western political ideas are secularized theological concepts. The most famous example that he uses is the concept of political sovereignty, which early modern political theorists modeled after the idea of God's sovereignty. I think that in our time and place, you know, his claims hold less water, or they are increasingly less true, right? I mean, we're always coming up with new political ideas and concepts, and I think it's less and less true that our culture is actively making reference to theology as we do so. But what I do think is true is that a lot of ancient theological ideas have been kind of embedded into our culture, like a sediment. So many of the ideas that feel to us to be just part of the water that we drink intellectually, I think are tainted with theology, so to speak. So many of us are using theological ideas in a sense, even when we don't necessarily think about it, or even when we don't necessarily think that we're doing so. So that brings me to my book. And this is one of the big points that I make in the book. And this is a book I just published with Columbia University Press, Sister Death. The article that I was invited to speak about today, The Letter to My Fellow Americans, was part of a series of 3 articles that I'm writing for Religion Dispatches, all of them to basically talk about my book. So each of the articles addresses and discusses a different aspect of my argument in the book. So I want to talk just a minute about the book. The big argument of the book is that today in America, the way that many of us, even secular people, have been conditioned to think about death and the relationship between life and death has been impacted by an old Christian theological idea. The idea that death is an enemy, and the idea that life and death are essentially at war. One of the places where you can see this really obviously, I think, in a secular culture is in the medical field or discourse about medicine. So medicine itself is often spoken about as a kind of war with death or a struggle with death, a battle against death. You can think about the struggle with specific diseases or the struggle to cure specific diseases like cancer. They're often described as a battle with or a war with death. As I mentioned in my book, this isn't the only way that Christianity speaks about death, but it is the most common and the most mainstream way that the tradition has typically talked about the relationship between life and death. So the Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the church in Corinth, tells the Corinthians that the last enemy of God is death, as he puts it. So Paul was an apocalyptic thinker, and in his mind, God was going to do away with death at the end of time. So when Jesus returns at the end of time and the dead are resurrected, they'll be resurrected into a world where death no longer exists. Can you hold on just one second? Is everything okay, Matilda?
Yes,
Okay. You know what? I'm going to help you when I'm all done, okay? I can't right now. I'm so sorry. I can't right now. I'm sorry. I will help you when I'm done, okay? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. My daughter was watching a movie while I'm doing this, and it looks like the device has run out of batteries. Okay. So anyway, I think she'll find something else to play with. But as I was saying, right, this idea, this apocalyptic idea that at the end of time, when Jesus returns and the dead are resurrected, they'll be resurrected into a world where death no longer exists. This is a vision of the Apostle Paul's. So the roots of the idea of heaven are already there in this vision of the end times. Later on in Christian history, the dominant belief came to be that the dead wouldn't have to wait until the end of time to live again. And instead, their soul would be able to live on in heaven or hell before that time came. But in the ancient world, for these ancient Christians, this was the promise of a future without death. Paul himself, he's not saying that death is bad or evil. This isn't what he's saying in that letter to the Corinthians. But over time, this is how many people came to interpret, they came to interpret it. So the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas argued, for instance, that death was a form of what he called natural evil. He also believed that sickness was a form of natural evil. Right. And this for him was essentially a category that described anything that was bad, but that wasn't necessarily morally bad. Right. It was just undesirable. But over the course of time, views did become less nuanced, as they often do when subject to much interpretation. So over the course of history, and this is one of the things that I explore in the book, death came to be lumped together with a whole host of other things that were negatively stigmatized in Christian culture. So things like evil, sin, non-belief and non-believers, the devil, but this also meant things like blackness and animality. And so death came to be thought of as the consequence of sin and evil, and as the consequence for being a non-human animal or being a racial other. Christians were, on the other hand, promised a life beyond death. They might have to pass through the death of their body, but they were assured eternal life for their soul. The non-believers, the sinners, the animals, the racial others, they were all destined for a future of death. So these are just a few key takeaways from the book. So I actually borrowed the figure of sister death from a Christian thinker or a Christian figure, which is Saint Francis of Assisi. He has a hymn where he talks about sister death. But he called death our sister. He called death a fellow creature. And I personally don't think that this makes a whole lot of sense. I don't think of death as a being so much as a power or a force. So this is why in the book, I'm instead arguing that life and death are sisters, that they are family. So this, importantly to me, still allows for tension between them. Sisters don't always get along, but they do have a deep and a complex bond. I think it's important for us to be able to think about the tensions and the antagonisms between life and death. And one of the key elements of staying alive is struggling against death in many guises. Okay, great. I don't want to minimize this. I don't think that death is just something to accept or make peace with. Right. I do think there are some rare people who can do this, but I don't think that most of us should be blamed for not being able to do this emotionally or spiritually. I think it's okay to feel resentment about death or to be afraid of it. I think on some level that's probably natural, but death is still nevertheless a part of things. It's inevitable. And what I have a problem with, and this is what I'm critical of in the book, is this idea that a natural and inevitable part of our life experience should be described as a state of war or a battle, the basic conditions of our existence, right? I don't want to live my life in a state of war. And I think that socially and politically, we run into real problems when there are people around us who believe that some select group of people are above death somehow. I think that in many ways, our mortality is what bonds and unites us. So I think this fact matters more than ever today. We're living in a globally connected planet where the conditions for staying alive are being actively destroyed and eroded right in front of our eyes. If we take our collective mortality seriously as Earthlings, we can see what this is already doing to the more than human world, right? It's driving mass extinction events in the more than human world. If we take our collective mortality seriously as Earthlings, then we can see this as a cue or a signal about what could potentially happen to us as well. If we take our collective mortality seriously as Earthlings and as humans, then we can work to try to make life livable for one another in the face of great threats. But if we dismiss our collective mortality, right, if we believe that for some reason there's a special category or class of person who isn't actually deeply affected by what's happening to us on Earth, if we believe that we're ultimately destined for some form of life that's better and more eternal in all of this, then I think we're at a very real risk of completely dismissing this global reality as not our problem. So I think we need to critique this old political theology of death, this idea that death is the enemy. Not because I think it's important for us to make peace with death, but more because I think it's important for us to take seriously our collective mortality as Earthlings. Okay, so to bring this back to the topic at hand, this is the article, this is just a screen grab of the article that I was invited to speak about here today that I wrote for Religion Dispatches. In all honesty, I didn't actually plan to write about guns for Religion Dispatches. I had planned to write 3 pieces for them. All of them were related to my book. I wrote one about the political theology of death and abortion. I wrote another, which is still forthcoming, on the political theology of death and race in America. And I was intending to write another one on human composting, actually. But as I was in the midst of writing these pieces, the school shooting in Nashville happened. And then the mass shooting at the bank in downtown Louisville. And that was actually several blocks away from where my daughter goes to school in downtown Louisville. So I spent an hour in a total panic that morning as I waited for the police to announce that the scene had been cleared. And my editor at RD asked if I could write something about guns after both of these events. And I told him that I would see what I could do. And I actually really struggled to write this piece because I wasn't quite sure how to come at it. I have a lot of thoughts about the need for gun control in America, but it wasn't entirely clear to me how to wrap that up or bring that into relationship with the arguments that I make in the book. But at some point on Twitter, I got into a conversation about leftists who buy guns. So people on the political left, that is, who might actually be angry about gun politics in America, but who buy guns anyhow because they're convinced that so many people on the right have guns, right? That this is the only way that they can protect themselves, that they're scared in essence. And, if I'm being honest, I will admit that I understand the fear that a lot of these people fear, right? I'm also increasingly afraid of other people. And I feel that when I'm out in public, sometimes, in a place like Louisville, Kentucky, where, open carry is pretty common. I always wonder if people are carrying guns or how many people are carrying guns in the public place that I'm in. But I also think a lot about how this kind of fear feeds on itself. Right? It creates more and more and more fear. I think fear works like that. It can often, capture us, take us in, feed us more, and refuse to let us go. And part of the reason that I wrote Sister Death was because I don't want to live in fear. I don't want to live my life as if it's a battle or a state of war, right? I want life to have more meaning, more love, and more beauty than that. And so, when I sat down to write this piece, I just wanted to think more about that fear and to confront it in this letter. And I wanted to acknowledge the fear, but I also wanted to stress that, if we have the capacity to look at that fear, to face it and to walk away from it, then I think we owe that to each other in some ways, socially and politically. So for those of you who haven't read the article, I thought that I would just read a brief excerpt of it. The whole piece is a letter, as I've mentioned, so it's written in the you form of address. And I hope that you'll be able to pick out some of the themes related to the demonization of death that I was talking about a little bit earlier. I've posted an image of roots here because I do think that these views on death are at the roots of some of our problems and struggles with gun politics. But I also just didn't want to post a picture of a gun. So I'll just read along. I'll just read, and feel free to read along or just listen. Maybe you believe that there's an evil in the world that travels like a virus. Maybe you're afraid that it's already spread to almost everyone else here in America. And you believe that you're still pure or clean, that you haven't caught it. And you'll do anything you can not to catch it, not to let your family catch it. Maybe you believe that those who've caught the evil have been marked as enemies of your God. And maybe you believe that any enemy of God is a friend of evil and death, one who is already doomed and therefore ineligible for the eternal life you hope and wait for. Maybe you believe that your gun will help you in a struggle for divine justice, God's war against death and those who are friends of evil and death. All right. So, yeah, I think, the problem is obviously bigger than a simple idea, right? I'm making a suggestion that these ancient theological ideas that I'm critiquing are, at the roots of some of the problems that we're having, like that they're part of the problem, but obviously the problem itself is vast and complex. I'm certainly not making any sweeping arguments about gun politics in general, but I do think that a basic view of life and death that many Americans harbor can only feed and foment a kind of resentment, a deep-seated fear, and a sense of superiority that gives ideological support to gun rights proponents. And there are a lot of reasons why Americans buy and own guns, obviously. But for those who do, there is a deep ideological and spiritual form of support for their way of thinking. This support might derive from the Christian tradition, right? It might come from the Christian tradition, but the ideas themselves have also been secularized. So I don't think that these views about life and death, right? Ideas about whose lives matter and whose lives don't, right? I don't think they're always inherently religious. A lot of these views show up, for instance, in a secular form of white supremacy. The idea that white people live lives that matter more, that they live a more privileged and eternal form of life, and racial others are destined to be more mortal. I think this can be articulated in language that isn't inherently religious. So I will be really interested to hear insights and questions from all of you. I'm interested to hear about what made you curious, what made you think, open to answering all kinds of other questions that you might have about anything I've discussed here. But in the event that you don't have any questions, I thought that I would throw a few of them out there, and these are, maybe questions for all of you to think about. So, what if the roots of the problem are deeper than a critique of Christianity, right? What if, for instance, there are elements of secular culture that have adapted these ancient Christian ideas, right? What would it look like, even from a secular perspective, to support other ways of thinking about life and death? So those are just a few of the questions that I have, and I'll stop the screen share because that's the last slide that I have, but I'm happy to discuss and reflect with all of you.
Well, I was finally able to wrestle with my Zoom, so I'm on my phone. It's still not working on my laptop, and unfortunately, because I was trying to mess with it, I didn't get to listen to nearly as much of your conversation as I would have liked to. So I'm going to put it out there for folks who are still here. Thank you for sticking with us while we're dealing with technical difficulties. If there are any questions, please throw them in the chat, and I will do my very best to answer any of your questions. The thing that struck me the most, I guess, from what I was able to really focus on and pay attention to is that, we've been talking about this a lot. And when I say we, I mean like, myself and my friends, and how we don't understand this, that everything that the other side does comes from a place of fear. Like I just don't live my life like that. In fact, I was in Tucson this past weekend to talk to a secular group down there. And one of the women asked me like, well, what are you doing to keep yourself safe? And I'm like, nothing. Like I just live my life, and I don't want to live in fear, and I'm not going to get a concealed carry permit. I'm not opposed to firearms, but I don't need to be one of those people at the Jack in the Box who has their AR-15 strapped on their back. And when I go to these school board meetings and people are, screaming at me in the name of Jesus or whatever, I just don't let it really bother me. Like the fear doesn't get to me. Sure, if I'm a woman, so if I walk alone in a dark parking garage, I'll use my keys as a weapon or whatever, but I'm not just sitting there waiting, like thinking that all of my neighbors are out to get me. So like, and I was raised in a mostly agnostic household. So like the fear of retribution from this angry God in the sky also doesn't really get to me. So like, I guess my question is it just religious people who are raised in some type of religion who have this kind of just like underlying fear about their neighbors or whatever? I mean, people are now like shooting each other as neighbors before they even ring the doorbell. Do you know what I mean? Like, so is it just that? Is it our culture, society? Where does this underlying fear that so many of my neighbors feel on a minute to minute basis, where does it come from exactly?
I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, I'm obviously not totally sure, but I do feel like to some extent, fear is socially contagious. I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about the night after the mass shooting here in Louisville, where, it was just a few blocks away from my daughter's school. And, I was, one of our good friends who is the dad of my daughter's best friend called, my husband and I, and he was like, he was really, really worked up. And he was just like, he's like, I feel like it just made me think a lot more about what actually are they doing at the school for security? He was like, I just don't know. He was like, I don't know how safe the doors are. I don't know what kind of cameras they have there. I don't know. I don't even know anything about what kind of like guards they have. And he was just like, I feel like we need to know more about this. And, he was like kind of getting all worked up. And I felt my own like heartbeat rise. And I was just like, okay, oh yeah, that is scary. That is really scary. Right. And, my husband, who's just very, determined not to live in fear, right, was like, okay, everyone, let's take a step back, and he was kind of, the voice of reason. And so, just having that voice of reason in the room was really helpful, I think, for both our friend and myself, because it just shifted the tone of the conversation. But I think that like, had that voice not been there, I think we would have gotten like a lot more worked up. And, I just was wondering what other kinds of conversations parents of the kids at that school were having, that evening. And I think, I will not be surprised if next year this is a magnet school. And so there's a lot of kids from all sides of town, a lot of kids from some of the wealthier suburbs. And I will not be surprised if some of those kids don't end up coming back to the school in the fall, because it's a downtown school. And I feel like there's probably some parents who are going to stigmatize the school because of its location and because of what happened downtown, which could have just as easily happened at a bank in the suburbs. Right. But I feel like there is a lot of fear that gets passed around in and through social contexts. And I think that when you're in a social context that values thinking rationally and trying to talk yourself down from feelings of fear and anxiety, I think that makes a difference. And I think that when you're in a social context where those kinds of fears and the amplification of those kinds of fears can be rewarded in certain ways, I think that also matters a lot too. And I think that a lot of people do belong to religious communities where, for a variety of reasons, there is, there's a lot of fear peddling. Yeah, I'm looking at, I just saw the last comment from Brandy, right? Fear of scarcity creates a culture that perpetuates the vouchers that ultimately steal money from the public schools. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of scarcity fear, a lot of resource fear. I think that there's a lot of economic anxiety. And I think that, when people find themselves in a religious community that not only takes that fear seriously, but that can also like capitalize on that fear in order to put that blame on specific people in the society around them that's not them, like they can kind of outsource the explanations of sort of why they're feeling this way. I think that can make a really huge impact. And I think, yeah, fear gets passed around socially. It gets passed around through certain ideas, habits of thinking, forms of thinking. And these are all things that happen in religious community.
And I mean, I'm thinking today specifically about these horrible Supreme Court cases, right? And first of all, the fictitious, the hypothetical case about Creative 303 or whatever, that, the woman who said, what if, oh my gosh, what if a gay couple asked me to create like, her fear is so like not based in reality. It's not real. And the Supreme Court handed down a decision on a hypothetical case today. That blew my mind, but it didn't surprise me. And nobody should be surprised if you're clutching your pearls right now. There are a bunch of people who tried to tell you that this was going to happen. And then, of course, the student loan forgiveness. I mean, I'm going to just go ahead and announce it here. A couple weeks ago, I got a statement from Mohila, who's now taken over the student loan accounts, and my loans, because I was able to get my public service loan forgiveness through in time, were forgiven. And I can't even begin to tell you how much gratitude and everything. But, a friend of mine actually, made a comment about like, well, you're welcome from the taxpayers or whatever. And it's like, we can all succeed and be successful. This isn't a scarcity thing. We need to get rid of that scarcity mindset. And if there is a public school teacher who has their loans forgiven, we should all be celebrating that instead of like trying to shame them for some reason. You know what I mean? And we do have some questions here too. So I want to make sure that we can get to these. This one's from Annika. Annika says, I came in a little bit late. If you covered this and I missed it, I apologize. The cult of Santa Muerte is often stigmatized because the cartels have embraced it, often leading to it being stigmatized by the Catholic Church. But I'm curious how you think their embrace, love for, befriending of death fundamentally puts it at odds with Catholicism's practice of fearing a death met without checking off various theological practices first. That's a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, Santa Muerte is like a really, really interesting figure. And I write about this a little bit in the introduction to my book. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, I found this really interesting interview between a couple of anthropologists and a trans sex worker in Mexico about Santa Muerte. And so this was a woman who did worship Santa Muerte. And so she was kind of reflecting on what that form of worship does for her. And, I think that she's kind of making the argument that in some ways, the core of fear, right? The sort of the seeds or the origins of fear is at its root, like a fear of death. And that, we all have our own little specific forms of fear, but at some kind of basic instinctual level, we're all afraid of death. And, part of what she gets out of the worship of Santa Muerte is a kind of, just an opportunity to kind of just come face to face with that fear and to try and transform it somehow, to try to transform it into some kind of courage. And I think that as a trans sex worker, this is someone who comes into, somebody who lives a very vulnerable life, right? Somebody who is more vulnerable to death than a lot of other people in society. And so, I think that that's probably true for a lot of people who work in the drug trade. I think a lot of them are probably extremely aware of the possibility of death. And, I don't know what a lot of those people find in the worship of Santa Muerte or the cult of Santa Muerte, but I think it's possible that that might be really potent and powerful for them as well. And I think that it's at odds with the Catholic Church because I think to some extent, it really flips some of Christian orthodoxies on their head, right? I mean, it's not that, it's not only that that death isn't bad, but that death is sanctified and made holy, which I think can, for some people, feel very counter-orthodox, I guess you could say.
Mhm. Yeah. There's a couple of more comments here. Sorry, it's so much harder on my phone and I'm doing my best. And I apologize. I put in a call to Zoom to try to figure out what the heck is going on. But this is a really good comment. I mean, Rivan actually says something, this is more of a comment than anything else, but what if we treated guns like automobiles, training, license, insurance, maintenance? We all seem to accept that both autos and guns are both useful and deadly. It's super annoying. But this is such an interesting one. This one comes from D. My biggest fear is the evangelical belief that they will be raptured. So they are comfortable doing things that can kill the rest of us, such as not having gun control, allowing death from miscarriage, and crippling education. And I'd like to add to that climate change too, because I've had, Christians tell me, don't worry about it. This is all part of God's plan. So what kind of God would want these people? Exactly, D. And we really need to fight for the separation of church and state. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that kind of one of the reasons why I was motivated to talk about all of this in the first place is that when I started to study theology, I was really offended by this idea that that life after death is somehow going to help us escape Earth. And it did seem to me when I started to learn about some Christian views of the afterlife that it was really just a way to kind of get away from Earth and to stop protecting it and to stop taking care of it. And that fundamentally I just found abhorrent. And I've actually since come to sort of be interested in some theories of the afterlife, because I don't actually think that all theories of life after death are fundamentally escapist. And I think that actually many of them are about sort of becoming embedded in nature and continuing on within the cycles of things. So I'm not trying to say anything in general about the afterlife as such, but I do think that how we think about the afterlife has a huge impact on how we live.
Yeah, I remember, so this is how naive I am, really. Like I said, my parents didn't really raise me with religion. And then I worked at this place where there was a very broad mix of people who were, we were all mothers, and some of us were what I call crunchy granola mothers, and we tended to be the left-leaning moms. And then there were also the crunchy granola moms on the right who were fundamentalist Christians, but they made all their own baby food, we all practiced detachment parenting and stuff like that. But I didn't really understand, where they were coming from necessarily. All I knew is that all the Mormons that I ever met are super nice. And then I did some research in an undergrad paper and I was like, whoa, this is a cult. Those really nice ladies were in a cult. I feel so bad for them. But they're, one of my friends who was in that group of moms was like, oh, we'll find all the vacation Bible schools and put the kids in there. And then that way we'll have a little break from the kids. And I was like, okay, that seems super benign. And I made it 1 week and my son happened to love it. And I joke about that with him still, and I still even kind of remember the John 3:16 song. And I never really read the Bible until then, because I was like, okay, if you're going to send your kid to a vacation Bible school, you should at least know what they're being indoctrinated with. And he loved that song, John 3:16, and would sing it over and over and over. And we got the cassette tape to go along with it. That's how old I am. And then I listened to it and I was like, wait, all you got to do is say that Jesus is the only Son of God and you just get to do whatever you want to and be forgiven? That's bullshit, And I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually how people think. And I was literally in my early 30s when I realized that people are like, I can do whatever I want to. And as long as I claim, that I'm a Christian, it doesn't matter. And I was like, well, that sounds like a bunch of BS.
And it's a pretty easy access form of of social superiority, or like it's an easy access to a form of or a sense of social superiority. And I think that can be really dangerous.
Let's see. So I want to make sure there's so many comments here. I'm trying to get them straight. So this one comes from Brandy. Fear of scarcity creates a culture that perpetuates the vouchers that ultimately steal money from our public schools. The idea that if they're limited, okay, we already went through that one, right? Yeah. And then to Dee's point, this is also the justification for not taking care of the earth and environment. I actually had somebody tell me that we don't need to worry about climate change because it's all part of God's plan. And then Mark says, I agree with the rapture comment. I just arrived back home, so I missed almost all the presentation. Well, you missed a bunch of technical difficulties. I impinge, if you were to ask the average millennial who Franklin Delano Roosevelt was and who JFK were, you'd get a lot of blank stares, sadly. Roosevelt said, we have no fear but fear itself. Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Okay. John says, thank you, Beatrice. Question, isn't it true that many evangelicals theoretically welcome death because they believe they will be raptured into heaven, and that this belief contributes to their unwillingness to act as stewards to our planet when it comes to issues like climate change?
Yeah. So this is interesting, and I speak about this a little bit in the book, where there is this. You'll see some people actually make reference to death as a precious enemy. So this is a kind of theological description of what death is as an enemy, because I mean, I think in some like theological discussions and circumstances, death is welcomed because it's essentially like just like when it comes, it means eternal life is coming next, right? And you can kind of see why like taboos and prohibitions against suicide would develop in a tradition like this, because when life after death is so highly prized and promoted, there's got to be something to kind of encourage people to hit the brakes a bit. But I think that, in many circumstances, death is spoken about as a kind of positive thing, in the sense that it shows how much power God has. Because what ultimately happens isn't that like death comes and then that's it, like that, you see that death is the most powerful thing. It's that death comes and then you see that God has power over death. And I think that, in the immediate term, I think one of the things that causes a lot of doubt for many Christians is, I think a lot of people wonder, does God actually have power over death? And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why there's such a kind of constant emphasis on this and celebration of the power that God has over death, because I think a lot of people are waiting for proof. They're waiting for evidence, but they're really, really hopeful that it's true. But I mean, I think the rapture is welcomed because it's a chance for God to finally show everyone how powerful God is and how God can essentially transcend death, do away with death, kill death, basically.
Yeah, I've watched a few like videos of people who are like hardcore evangelicals, and they'll predict, okay, the rapture is going to take place on this particular day, and then like the after videos are kind of my favorite, where they're like, yeah, so our prediction was wrong, but that's okay. Like, it doesn't even matter that, that they were so confident that God is going to come back on this particular day. And then when that day passes, they're like, well, so it didn't happen. We're really disappointed, but it's okay because it's all part of God's plan. It's like, what? Wait, the logic there, the ability to be able to bend and do those mental gymnastics. I'm just not that good at it. Here's another comment from Annika. I fear the loan ruling, so the student loan forgiveness ruling, allowing those without standing to bring a case may trickle down to queer people too. Maybe next, people without standing will have a right to go after the parents of trans kids who are supportive of their trans children. And then when does it transform into a war against trans adult by people who have no standing? Yeah. And then Annika goes on to say, I discovered Santa Muerte when I was a trans sex worker. For me, it was just a fun way to give an extra middle finger to the theologies that oppressed me. And by the way, I'd like to add, there's a great HBO Max. Now they're called Max. It's hard to keep straight, but Max has a great documentary called The Stroll that documents trans sex workers and just trans lives in general. It's really, really, really well done, and I highly recommend it. There's also one that's a bit older called Transhood. So if you want to learn more about what it's like to be trans in America or anywhere else for that matter, both of those documentaries are great.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just I think Santa Muerte is definitely a big middle finger to to theological traditions. So yeah, I can absolutely see that for sure.
See, and I'm just here pretending because I'm completely unfamiliar with it. And I wrote it down so that I'll be able to research it after this. So
Yeah, really interesting.
Brandy says too many Christians have adopted the death is an escape of earth idea and forget the passage where they are told they're responsible for and the earth is entrusted to their care. And she goes on to say, as someone that was raised in the Christian tradition, I always worried I wasn't going to be worthy and would end up in hell. So I never looked forward to death. Oh, that's so sad. That's really sad.
Yeah. No, and you know, from other former evangelicals that, you know, they, you know, that when they were kids, for instance, they were encouraged not to be sad when people died or not to mourn the death of their loved ones because they were, you know, they were making it sound like their loved one wasn't in heaven or wasn't, you know, still living on in God's in with God. And so, I mean, I think that also kind of robs people of the opportunity to process their grief and their mourning, which I think is, I think it's a part of it's a part of like healthy processing, emotional processing.
It's a part of our shared humanity, you know, like some of us deal with it differently. And so to just even acknowledge, you know, like instead of like, once again, suppressing what you naturally feel because your God tells you, well, if you feel that way, then you're, you know, you're flawed in his eyes and you're unworthy of his love or whatever. It just makes me really sad to think that that's how people were raised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jackie, this is in the Q&A. Jackie says, what would you say to help people separate individuals from ideologies that individuals participate in? Good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I say in the book, and I say this to people when I'm having conversations about you know, death and theology, is just that there's not one way of thinking about death, even in the Christian tradition itself. You know, I think that there's a lot of people who get it into their heads that whatever, you know, whatever kind of language their own particular community uses to speak about things like life and death, that's just the way that it is. But actually, in different community contexts and in different texts, you know, there are different ways of thinking. There are different languages that are used. And I think that sometimes when you can kind of take a step back from the idea itself, see what it is, see how you feel about it, see if it really resonates as something that's true for you. You can also open up a little bit of space to start considering other ways of thinking. And sometimes those other ways of thinking can also just be as much a part of your tradition as the idea that you thought was, you know, the Christian way of thinking. But I think, you know, I think there's so many people who grow up in Christianity and evangelical Christianity, especially in the US, who think that like there is a Christian view, right? That there's just, this is how Christians think, this is what Christians do. And, you know, when you actually like look at Christian history, when you look at anthropology, and when you look at different Christian communities around the world over the course of both time and space, you know, you actually do see that there are a huge range of diverse perspectives. And you know, I always, especially with my students, I always just want to encourage people to sort of, you know, really ask themselves like what feels true. And, you know, when you start to look at this with your own beliefs and values and perspectives and your deepest sort of emotional and spiritual and psychic, you know, capacities, you know, is this what actually feels true to you? And maybe would you like to consider some other some other perspectives?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're getting accolades here in the chat. I apologize and thank you for just being so nimble and being able to help us. Apparently there was an update on Zoom yesterday, which may have affected. I had a regular meeting today, this morning, no problems whatsoever. It could be the webinar format that's only the problem, but either way, I do appreciate you for not only joining us today, but also being able to just be a pro and present even in the midst of all these technical difficulties. So what I typically will ask people to at the end, because these conversations that we have Friday at lunch are a little bit heavy. So what is something here, or what is something current right now in this world where we're dealing with all this existential nonsense, climate change and violence and shootings and, a SCOTUS gone amok and all that kind of stuff. What gives you hope during these times?
One of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, I'm working on a new book project on underworlds. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is fungus. I've been thinking about mushrooms, and they're very hot right now. Lots and lots of people are thinking and talking about mushrooms and fungi because there are actually a lot of people who see in them not only models for kind of living in a pretty destroyed world, but also they also see in fungi possible resources to kind of help us deal with some of the mess that has been made for us. So I really, really like reading about and thinking about mushrooms and fungi right now.
That's my favorite answer so far, and one that I was not expecting, and I love it. And they just had a whole thing, I think it was yesterday on NPR, just talking about the fact that that some states are allowing for there to be more research on fungus and microdosing and things like that. And I know plenty of people who do that, folks who have PTSD for various reasons, whether it's because they served in the military or had a difficult upbringing, or just have regular old anxiety disorder, and they're making their way through life. So I love that. Actually, maybe we could find somebody. All y'all, maybe y'all can find somebody this weekend to have a really good 4th of July weekend. And I wanted to say too that your child is so, I don't know how old your kid is, but the fact that they came to you were like, Mom, I'm having a problem. You're like, don't worry, child, we'll settle this, but Mommy's doing this right now. It's very impressive. How old is your kid?
7. Yeah. She was very excited because she got to watch My Neighbor Totoro for the 11th time, but apparently my iPad died, so.
Let that be a lesson. But no, thank you so much, Beatrice. This was a great conversation. And again, I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate you just being able to roll with the punches. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, and everybody else, I hope you all have a great weekend. We'll see you next week, but remember it's at 7 o'clock next week. So I'll see you all later.
Everyone.
All right, bye-bye.